In a previous video, we looked at creating a skeleton for this stag beetle here. And then in another video, we looked at applying the skin weights, of applying this skeleton to this collection of meshes for the stag beetle. And now what that gives us is the ability to pose this creature here, because we can move the individual joints primarily through rotation. Rotation of the joints is what we call FK, or forward kinematics. And using rotation, as well as some translation, we can pretty much pose this creature any way that we wish. But in this video, we're going to take a look at how we can add some very simple additional functionality to this that will make it easier to both pose and to animate. In this video, we'll be taking a look at IK, or inverse kinematics. So let's take a look at what I mean by IK. I'm going to create a very simple chain, a chain of joints here, something like a leg, and we can of course translate it, and we can rotate the various joints on it. And if we want to place this, if we want to position it in any kind of way, what we would need to do is, for instance, rotate at the hip, rotate at the knee, and then potentially, when we have a foot on here, rotate at the foot as well. So that's rotating 3 different joints. To add IK to this chain, we go to Skeleton, Create IK Handle. And then I can click first on the hip and then here at the ankle, and it'll create this node here, this IK handle node. And if we grab that IK handle node, now what we can do is move it, and it moves the skeleton. It's a little bit hard to see the skeleton right now because of the color that it's changed it to. I hope that you can see that. But by moving this single node here, it actually moves all 3 joints on our IK chain here. Perhaps to see that a little bit better, I'll actually animate this handle. I'm going to key it on frame 1, I'll key it on frame 24, go to frame 12, or actually maybe I'll go to frame 6, move the handle over here, go to frame 12, move it here, go to frame 18, move it here, and now you'll be able to more easily see how this is animated. So let's go ahead and start creating some IK handles for our insect here. I'm going to do this from the top viewport. We'll go ahead and start perhaps at with the front leg here. Once again, I'm going to go to Skeleton, or Skeleton, Create IK Handle, and we'll create a IK chain from this joint here to the end here. And we can test it out. And you can see how that's actually working. We can now easily pose the leg, and without having to rotate 3 different joints, we can just simply place, through translation, the IK handle here. Now if I grab the root here and I move it, you'll see that the IK is currently not sticky. If we want it sticky, we can go through the process of making it sticky. We can go into its properties here. I believe somewhere here we'll have, here, we have this property of stickiness, which is off. And we can turn that on, make it sticky. And now, if I move the hip, the foot stays planted. Now, I think I'm actually going to uncheck sticky. I'll turn that off again because I'm going to show you another way that we can make it behave sticky. But I'll show you that in a little bit. We'll go ahead and create the rest of our IK chains here. Maybe I'll return back to the top viewport, go to skeleton, create IK handle. Notice that if I actually open up the options here, I can tell it to make it sticky right from creation instead of going into the attribute editor. So we can go ahead and turn, actually I'm not going to turn that on because I said I'm going to show you another way to make it sticky. So we'll just leave it at that setting. We'll create another chain, this time for the middle leg, the middle right leg. Create one for the back leg. Go over to the other side. And create IK chains for those legs as well. So now we have 6 IK handles which we can use to animate and pose our insect here. Now remember that I actually didn't make the IK handles sticky, so when I move the hip, the feet don't stay planted. But as I said, I'm going to show you another method for making them sticky, a method that I actually prefer. One other thing to take note of is that these names for these IK handles, we could of course change them so that we could change this IK handle 1 to reflect that it's affecting the right front leg, and so on. I think it does make sense to use naming conventions in your, in your rigging. So I'm going to go ahead and just spend a couple moments doing that. So I spent about a minute renaming these handles. I again think it makes a lot of sense to use naming conventions in your Maya files because they can get quite complicated. As you can see, we've got a lot of meshes, we've got a lot of joints in our scene. Now we've got 6 different IK handles in here, and by using a naming convention, I don't need to select the object in my outliner and then look at where it's situated to know what it is. I can simply look in my outliner and I know, for instance, that this handle here is the left middle leg, and I can just select it, and sure enough, it's the left middle leg. Now, there is one thing about these IK handles and these IK legs that we need to have some control of, that simply translating in space like this is not going to give us. And that is the, well, I would just call it the knee orientation on these, because while maybe these aren't exactly knees like on a human character, if we had a human character, we'd need to be able to not only move the foot in 3D space like this, we'd also need to change the orientation of, let's say, the knee. How can we do that? Well, if we select the IK handle, as I have selected here, we go to the channel box over here. There is a property called twist. And if I select that twist, select the word here, and then left mouse drag in my viewport, you can see that I have this additional control for being able to pose the leg. So this is really, really important. Now, if I went in here and I selected each of my IK handles and I made them all sticky, we would basically have something then that we could animate. We could animate and pose it quite easily. Because now I can take the hip and I can move it, the feet stay planted. Unless I pull the character up beyond so the legs need to stretch out to point at its handles, but otherwise this works very nicely. Rotate. And so on. We could animate this, we can pose it, we can do everything we want with it. I'm going to show you, as I said before, another way to make these sticky without actually setting the stickiness on them. So I'll go ahead and turn that off on all of them. And what I'm going to do is create a NURBS curve. I'm going to go to Create, NURBS Primitives, and I'll go ahead and just make a circle. And I'm going to use my snap to point tool, and I'm going to snap it right to the end of this chain here. Right here. Perhaps I'll scale the circle up a little bit. And I think instead of the degree being cubic, I'll make it linear. That can help as far as knowing a little bit more about how it's actually oriented. Maybe we'll make it a little larger. I'm going to freeze the transforms on it. I think I'll also change its color by going to the attribute editor. Under drawing overrides, we can enable overrides, and for instance, if I make it yellow, that'll be something that's really easily visible. If I deselect, you'll see that's much more visible. This is going to be my animation control for that leg. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and create 5 more of these. I'll simply duplicate this. Pop them into place as well. Maybe I'll hide the meshes just to simplify this a little bit more. You can see what we have here. The benefit of doing this is creating these controls. Instead of directly animating these handles, these curves are easier to see, they're easier to select, and they'll make for really good animation controls. I'm going to go ahead and just spend a few moments renaming them. So I spent just a moment renaming those controls that I just created. Again, this just makes logical sense because now I can look in my outliner and I know exactly what these are because they don't have these vague names. That's going to make animating and working with these so much easier later on. They're not currently doing anything. If I grab the hip, you can see that's not actually doing anything with the IK. One thing I wanted to do before I go any further is take these controls that I have here and freeze the transforms on it. I actually don't want this transform data on here, and I'll show you why in just a moment, but you'll have to just trust me on this. I'm going to select all of these controls here, and I'm going to freeze the transforms. Modify, freeze transformations. Now, if I select any of these, you'll see that they all have their translate X, Y, and Z on both rotate and translate set to 0 and their scale set to 1. These are the default values. This is what you want. Now I'm going to take my IK controllers and I'm going to drag them into these animation controls. So we'll go ahead and just take the RF handle and drag it right into the RF control. Take the right middle IK handle, drag it into its control, and so on. I'm using the left mouse button to do this. Sorry, I'm using the middle mouse button to do this. I'm using my middle mouse button to drag and drop these things into their controls. Now remember that these IK controls, these IK handles, do not have stickiness on them, but now that I've placed them into these groups, you'll notice that, in fact, the IK stays planted. We can also grab these controls, not just the hip on the creature here, and you can see that we can easily place them. This is going to allow us to nicely animate this creature. Now, one thing about that though is that if I want to do that rotation at the knee or the twist, I still need to select the IK handle. Here we'll do it on the right front leg, and go to the channel box, to the twist property, and then using my left mouse button, I'm scrubbing in the viewport to adjust the knee orientation of the beetle. So let's take a look at how we can make this even a little bit more easy to work with, so that I don't have to select the IK handle to access that twist property. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select all 6 of my controllers here, and I'm going to go to Modify, Add Attribute, and I'm going to add this property, which we will call Twist. I'm going to keep it as a float. That just means then that it can have values of 1, 2, 3, 8, 44 or whatever, but it can also have values of 77.32 and values like that as well. So it's not just whole numbers as the integer would be. We can set the minimum to, actually we're not going to do anything with the minimum and maximum, but if you want to set a range, then you can. We don't need to for this particular case, and we'll go ahead and add that property. So now we have, on each one of these controls, we have this added attribute called twist, which currently doesn't do anything. Because it's not connected to anything, but here's how we can connect the IK's twist property to this twist attribute of our control. With my control selected, We're going to go to Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. The left side here is what you could consider, let's say, the driver, and then the right column here will be what is driven. So we currently have our control selected. We created that new attribute called twist, which we can select. And if we select the IK handle that is nested inside that group, we can load that on the right. And we're going to apply my controller's twist property to the twist attribute of the IK handle. So now, if we select this control and we work with the twist, you'll see that it actually, with one control, we can situate the leg how we want, and we can adjust its twist property. In fact, if we were to select the IK handle nested underneath, you'll notice that it has this yellow tick mark indicating that the twist property is being controlled by something else. In this case, it's being controlled by this animation controller that we just created. I'm going to go ahead and go through the process of making that same connection to the rest of my controllers here. I'll speed up the process. Probably at a certain point we'll go ahead and go through one more together, and then I'll just quickly do the rest of them. So remember, you select the object that is going to be the driver. Go to Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. Then you can load up what's going to be controlled or driven. In this case, it's the right middle IK handle. Load it into the right column. Select the attribute on the left column that you want to control of the attribute on the right column. Just like that. It's as simple as that. Now, when I select that control, it works. Now, as I said, I'm going to go ahead and go through the rest of them very quickly, so I'll speed up the video at this point. So earlier I told you that you should freeze the transforms on these controls before you nest the IK handles underneath and before you do all those connections. Let me show you why it's so valuable to have the transforms frozen to initially do that freezing of the transforms. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly place these controls in various positions like this, nothing in particular, nothing realistic. So you can see how I've placed all these controls in random places, and the benefit of freezing those transforms initially before we set this up is that now I can easily select all those controls, and if I just come over here to my channel box and zero them out, they return right back to that initial position very quickly, very easily. This is really powerful and really useful for animators. There are a couple things maybe I should have done that I think would have improved this a little bit more. And some of those things are referring to, let's say, the shape of these controllers here. Right now, they don't really give me an indication of direction, and oftentimes I like to have that indication of a direction in here. So maybe I'll just select them and go into their component mode, and I'll just make a quick little change to them. That should be good. The benefit of this, of course, is that they're pointing in the direction, and so that it gives us more of a sense of direction with them. It's not as important with this particular model, to tell you the truth, but you could see where this could be important with something that has more like a human foot on it. Another thing I wish I had done a little bit differently with this rig as I was creating it is I wish I'd created one more joint to treat this area as a foot, because I think then that we could get really a nice sense of weight on this area when we place the foot down. We could suggest a little bit of a sense of an impact happening here, and also we could orient this a little bit more easily. But this should work just fine. And one more thing I like to do maybe as part of the rigging process would be maybe to create one more control here. I'm going to create another circle for this, and maybe I'll just expand it a little bit, make it a little bigger. We'll go ahead and also make it linear. I'm going to come into its attributes, activate the enable overrides, and I'll give it a color. Maybe I'll make this one red, like that, so it's very visible. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to nest the hip underneath. Well, let's just call this, we'll name it first. We'll call it main control, or maybe just main. I'm going to freeze the transforms on it, because right now I have this scale data and I really don't want to have that on there. We'll go ahead and take the hip, we'll drag it into main. We'll also take all of these leg controls that I created and we'll put them under main also. What does this give us? Well, this gives us an easy way to move the insect wherever we want, and it moves the whole rig with it. In fact, we may even be able to scale the whole rig. You see that this is different than actually scaling the character. We're scaling the rig, but that actually is scaling the character along with it, because the character, the creature, is being driven by the skeleton, which is nested underneath that main control. So this gives us a very convenient way of moving this wherever we want, situating it wherever we want before we actually start posing it or animating it. And then we can still come in here and grab these individual controls and do whatever we want with it when it comes to posing and animating this creature. Now, this is fully functional, and we can pose it and we can animate it just like we want. If I were to push this further, my next step would be probably to create more of these NURBS curves and use them as controllers for my rig. Right now, if I want to animate, let's say, the pinchers, I can simply grab the actual joints themselves and I can animate those. Or if I want to animate the head, I can select its joint and I can animate it. And that works perfectly fine. That works just great. But my preference actually is to create these NURBS curves as controls so that I'm never actually directly animating the skeleton itself. That's my preference, but it's not necessary. It's a little bit more work, and I'm not going to really get too much into that in this video. We went a little bit into that with these controls. But that would be, if I were to push this rig a little bit further, the next step. I would create more NURBS curve controllers so that I never actually have to directly animate the joints themselves. But animating the joints directly is perfectly fine and acceptable. One other thing to understand about the IK also is that it's different than forward kinematics. Remember, forward kinematics, if we wanted to pose this leg, we would need to bend it at this joint, and this joint. So that's 3 different joints we'd need to be bending it to pose it. The IK controller conveniently allows us to deal with just one control and to bend all of those joints however we want, posing it, placing it, and so on. But the IK does give us an option to be able to switch back to FK. With this particular insect, I don't think I would need to do that, but if necessary, I could. I could simply select the IK handle itself, come over here into the channel box to its properties, and there's this attribute called IK blend. And right now it's set to 1, which means it's on. If I switch that to 0, it will turn it off, in which case we can directly rotate using FK. And in fact, we can switch somewhat between IK and FK. It kind of complicates things a little bit, but that is a possibility, sometimes a very useful one, especially if you're dealing with a human character. I'm going to go ahead and set the IK back to 1 so that it's being entirely influenced by my IK. Notice that if I try to rotate these individual joints when the IK is activated, it in fact will not let me do that. You can see that I cannot bend or rotate at the joints when the IK is enabled. I need to select this control to be able to pose the leg. So in this series of videos, we've taken a look at creating a custom skeleton for our creatures or characters. We've also looked briefly at doing the skin weights. And we looked at a couple other additional rigging techniques, in particular using IK or inverse kinematics. I hope that this series of tutorials has been helpful for you, and thank you for watching.